So today we're going to be working on some cone flowers, also known as echinacea. Hopefully I'm saying that right. So with your flowers, in general, a lot of times with flowers, I want to have like an odd number of them. So the two main flowers we're going to draw are these two, and then probably also like a little one like that. So when you're drawing flowers, a lot of times what I want to do is start off with the center. So I kind of have a frame of reference where all the petals are going to come out of. And sometimes I can even like map out how big the overall flower is going to go. So then I know if I'm going to run out of room before I get to my next paper. And then I'm going to plan how big this one's going to be. So, and then after that, then I could start shaping the top of my flowers a little bit more like a dome. Because, you know, that's how the cone flowers get their name, is because a lot of times the petals more form at the bottom and then the top is pretty rounded. So after that, then I want to kind of treat each of my petals like little ovals at first. And a lot of times I'll do this very lightly and loosely, just so I can make sure, again, I have enough room for all of my petals. And then from there, then I would start making them a little bit more detailed. So kind of looking at how they have little ruffled edges. They get a little bit smaller as they touch the center. And then that's basically how I would do your drawing. Obviously, you would keep going. And then you could add like a little stem for those two. And then I went ahead and pre-drew my flowers onto my watercolor paper. So you can kind of see how I went ahead and did 3 flowers. And then next what we're going to do is start on the inking. So for the inking, I like to start off with a very small pen. So this is a 005. And the smaller pens are always good, because then a lot of times smaller pens are always better, because you can always make your lines thicker, but you can't really make them thinner again. So I'm going to start off by first outlining everything. And when I'm outlining the tops of my flower, I want to give them kind of a organic, kind of ruffled edge, because if you look at your picture, you can kind of see how these are, you know, a little bit bumpy. They're not perfectly smooth, and I really want to be sure that I do that on each of my flowers. And then for my petals, I want to have kind of the same idea, obviously not the same shape, but there are also a little bit ruffled at the edge, and then they typically have kind of smooth sides. So I'm going to go ahead and outline each of my flowers. So now that I have almost all of my flowers outlined, one thing to think about is the reason why I didn't outline this one is because this one is supposed to be farther back in the picture. So one way you can get that illusion of kind of space is, you know, making these inking lines a little bit more defined. And then this flower, I'm going to have a little bit looser. So I might not press as hard when I'm outlining this one. And I can kind of be a little looser and have fun with it, but that's up to you. I mean, you could always make it exactly the same as the other two. You don't have to make it exactly like this, or you could even not use the inking on this flower. And I'm going to go ahead and also draw a little bit of a stem, but I'm doing it very loosely. And I could also kind of gesture in maybe, you know, some leaves. Kind of have fun with it. Awesome. Okay, so now that I have all this basically inked in, now I can start on my shading. So for the shading, I want to focus in on how a lot of times on these petals, you can kind of see it gets a little bit darker as you get closer to the center. And I'm going to use kind of some long hatching lines for that. So I'm going to gently kind of flick the ink pen and do some long lines for shading. And I'm going to do that on each of my petals, but I also want to emphasize and go over some of these petals again with some inking lines, especially if they're like underneath another one, because you don't want it to look really flat, like every single one is exactly the same. So like on the ones that are on top, I might just do, you know, some of those lines very lightly, and then make the second row a little bit darker. And then for like my center, instead of, you know, filling every single little spot on there, because it's full of spots, you know, little tiny spots, I could do like little tiny squiggles for texture. You could do like the scumbling technique where you roll your pen. Another thing I like to do sometimes is if it's a really big open area, I'll sometimes just block it in with some hatching just over the whole thing, maybe a little bit over here, so that the center is kind of lighter. So I could do that on this one as well. But you can also, you know, try out techniques. I always like to practice these techniques in pencil first and then see how I like it afterwards. But with the center, don't get, you know, too heavy-handed with the inking, because you could spend a lot of time on the inking, and then, you know, the watercolor ends up not showing up enough because you put so much detail into the inking, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you don't want that. And then I'm going to go ahead and shade the rest of my petals, and also I'm going to shade a little bit of hatching on my stem, especially where it's right underneath the flower. Okay, so now that I'm done with my inking, I'm going to go ahead and start layering in some watercolor. So one note about my inking is, again, I kept it very light on the flowers I'm kind of having in the back, and then these ones I'm trying to make, you know, the shading fairly dark like in the picture. So I probably need maybe to layer a little bit more there. That should be about good. So color-wise, in watercolor, you always want to start off with your lighter colors first. So I'm going to be starting off first with some cadmium yellow, which, you know, cadmium yellow is kind of like a very basic kind of primary yellow. Another yellow you could use is like lemon yellow if you wanted it to be even brighter. But I like cadmium yellow because it's fairly warm. And I'm going to go ahead and mix a very nice light wash, and I'm going to go over my whole entire centers like that. And then while it's wet, I can take a little bit of burnt sienna, which is like a terracotta kind of color, and I'm going to add a little tiny bit of orange to that so it's even brighter. And I'm going to go wet into wet and drop into it while it's still wet, which hence the word wet onto wet. And then while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next flower. So, and just be careful not to over tap, because that's how you end up losing all that pretty yellow that we just put in there. So you want to make sure to leave enough room so that the yellow does not get taken over. So I'm going to do it on this one. Take some burnt sienna and orange. And I'm gently tapping to kind of let the watercolor move where it wants to, because with watercolor, if you use your paintbrush or scrub with it, it's going to just turn it into one color. And then I don't want this flower to be as bright as these two, so I'm going to actually fill that whole one with the kind of burnt sienna orange color instead of the yellow. And then I'll use more burnt sienna and less water to fill the rest of it. And we're going to come back in and do another coat a little darker. This is just kind of like a beginning coat. And then while these are drying, I'm going to now do a green. So one thing to think about when you're mixing greens is if I use like this bright green, So you can kind of see that over there. If I use that everywhere, it's not really going to look as dark as it needs to in the picture. So one way you can darken a green is you can take brown, which also makes it, you know, kind of a army green when you add brown to it. So a lot of times instead I'll add a little bit of red. And then again, if it gets too brown, I will add a little bit of blue. And the blue I'm adding is just like some ultramarine blue. So then there you go. It's a little bit more toned down. So I'm going to go ahead and paint in my whole entire stem and that baby leaf. Doing a very, whoopsies, light wash, and make sure not to drop your paintbrush. And also this one. And very lightly, I'm going to fill in some of these inked leaves. And I'm just trying to use whatever is on my palette right now for those, because they're very loose. What's fun about leaves is once you put in one color, you could always take a darker green, which could be that same green, but just with a little bit more blue and a little bit more red, and that'll help make it a little darker. And I can use that and just kind of drop it in while that green's still wet, and that adds some fun variation to my leaves. And this one I kind of want to be a little happier green. And that one I'm going to wait until I do my background. Okay. I could always do another coat of some of that dark green underneath here. And then now this should be about dry. Obviously you could always wait a little bit longer. So for my flower petals, if you're really worried about going over some of your white spaces, you could have masked off those white areas first, but I'm not too worried. So I'm going to come in with a nice light pink. So a great way to make a pink is alizarin crimson, which is a very pretty, bright, kind of pinky red. And when you add a lot of water to it, it turns pink. This color actually I think is rose, so it's a lot more vibrant than alizarin crimson. So alizarin crimson with a lot of water looks like this. So you can see it's a little bit deeper. So, but if you have a pink, you could use that instead, or you could even turn these into daisies. They kind of look like daisies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in on my petals and paint each of them in and leave some little white highlights showing. So I'm using kind of a small round brush. Kind of painting petal by petal. And if you're worried about accidentally like running over the petals or having them all blend together, you could always skip every other petal instead of doing it the way I am. And we're going to come back in with a darker pink later. So don't worry if you accidentally get rid of all of your highlights, because we'll make some of that up. And I could go ahead and fill in that one over there, since they're already touching. And then my far away petal, I'm not going to have as much detail. So I'm filling all of it in, except for a little highlight on the top of those petals. And if you make an oops, that's okay. You could always take a wet brush and kind of lift it up. And that makes up for it. And then to make a little bit of a darker pink, what I could do is just use more of that pink and less water, or I could use more red into my mixture. And then for the darkest dark, we'll actually take that red and add a little bit of ultramarine blue so it gets almost like purple. So it looks like that. So next what I'm going to do is start coming in, because this is drying fairly quickly, and I'm going to start going over some of those lines that I did in the ink, just to emphasize those a little bit. And I would take a little bit of water, go on top to soften the edges. So another thing you can do with this pink is, let's say I'm doing this petal that's underneath that one, I could use that pink as a shadow to go right underneath that petal, and then fade it with a little bit of clean water. So I keep that bright pink still. And then I can take some of that purple and make it a little darker, just where it's kind of touching the center especially. And if you're not sure if it's dark enough, it's always good to kind of let it dry, because watercolors tend to dry a little bit lighter, just because at first it's, you know, if it's too watery, then the paint isn't really going to stick. And I'll go ahead and do that on my other flower. Obviously, take your time on this. I'm just putting it in real quick. And I'm also darkening, you know, if you have any petals that are underneath others. I'm trying to be a little more forward with that purple. And then my back one, to make it look a little blurry, I could actually wet the petal first. Take a little bit of my pink, kind of drop it in each of those sections, rather than trying to make it super detailed. So, and then while that's drying, it's always another thing, I'm going to take some burnt sienna and Payne's gray, which is a really nice kind of dark bluey gray, and I'm trying to make a nice dark brown. And what I'm going to do is use that to tap on top of my center, because I'm trying to leave some of that orange showing through. And I'm tapping over here near the center. And then let's say I get it too tapped, you know, and it looks, you know, like there's flies all over it. Then that means I could come in with some other colors and try and tap in between, or even just use a little water to go in between those colors. Like that. So then I still have a little bit of that yellow showing through. So, and again, if you're really worried about maybe your yellow disappearing, then I could always mask those areas off and come back to it. But I'm not too worried about that. So now I'm going to start tapping in again with that brown, trying to leave some of that yellow showing through. And I want it really dark down here, so I'm going to use a little more Payne's gray. And then it gets a little browner up at the top. And it's okay if it doesn't look exactly like the picture, you know, as long as you're having fun with it and loosening up. And I'll probably come back in and darken this just a little bit more. Ah, much better. And then another little trick that you can do is taking a Kleenex and lifting a little bit off. Like maybe if you went a little too crazy, you could lift a little bit off or come back in with white paint. So, and then lastly, I have my little blurry flower over here. So I'm gonna, again, keep it kind of dark. Let's see. Oh, and I just saw I need a little bit of dark to overlap my petals a little bit. And if you wanted to, you could also do salting, which is very fun to add, especially to blurry things or things that you are kind of lacking in texture. And I'm going to add some of that orange back in, like that. So, and then it's up to you if you want to add a background to your painting, or I could just leave it with very loose, you know, leaves and grass. I could come back in and add maybe a little bit more leaves over here. And then a lot of times I am addicted to splattering. So I could take my pink colors and just splatter it into the background and having fun with it. But if you're not really a big fan of splattering, you want to do the green background, what I would do is wet. That water is not clean. That's okay. I would wet my little sections first. And then you could take in your greens. And then some yellows. And kind of just doing it wet onto wet. So, and a lot of times if you find that your colors, you know, don't blend very much, could be you're not using enough water. And also kind of rotating your brush like this is very helpful. And I want a good amount of yellow right near my flowers, so they really pop out. And I'm trying to leave just a little bit of white around my flowers, just to keep it loose. But you don't want it to be too firm of like an outline. So I'm trying to kind of drop a little bit of green in every so often. A little bit over here. And then I could also add more splatters on top, which I could use green. And always make sure to do it on a surface that you are not afraid of getting paint on. And then of course a little bit of pink, which pink and green are complementary colors, so it may make a little bit of brown. And then I can lift off of my painting if I got it in areas I didn't want it. So, happy painting and enjoy your flowers.